The wind comes down the coulee in the dark, and somewhere under a barn floor a lamp is dying. Snow drives sideways across a buried valley in Montana territory, swallowing the fences, the roofs, the last thin threads of chimney smoke. One homestead at the ragged edge stands darker than the rest. No smoke, no track, nothing moving in the yard. Push closer, past the frozen doors, down through a seam in the planks no eye was meant to find. A woman kneels in a room dug into the earth, her bare hand against warm stone, her two children breathing slow beside her. Outside 30 below. Down here the flame leans gutters, starves for air that will not come. She has answered every question the winter asked her. Everyone but this. The lamp shrinks to a thread. Above her the drift seals the only door. And her small daughter stirs and whispers that she cannot breathe. From the rutted freight road that ran the whole crooked length of Dunmore Coulee, the Carrow horse barn looked like nothing at all. It looked like every other structure thrown up by hopeful, tired hands across the Montana territory. In those years, a low roof pitched hard against the weatherboard walls, gone the color of ash and old bone, a loft crammed to the rafters with oat straw, and inside the slow, warm shifting of 3 horses and 1 gray mule breathing their heat into the dark. A man driving his wagon past it in the autumn of 1886 would not have slowed his team. Nothing about the place asked him to. Nothing about it hinted that under those worn floorboards and the frozen clay beneath the animal's feet, a widowed mother had already begun to dig a bedroom for her children, and that before the winter was finished, it would become the one shelter in the whole valley that the wind could not find a way into. By the following January, the hardest freeze the Coulee had ever set down in living memory would bury cabins to their eaves, choke chimney after chimney, until the smoke gave up and turned ordinary homes into ice boxes with families still huddled inside them. Out on the open range, the cattle would drift before the wind until the fence lines stopped them, and there they would stand and die in their hundreds, frozen upright in the drifts, with the frost thick as fur across their backs, in numbers so great that when spring finally came, the ranchers would not bother to count them but only to drag them away. That winter would be spoken of for 50 years afterward as the season the country broke. And in the middle of all that white ruin, the strangest dwelling in Dunmore Coulee would stay warm, dry, and quietly alive, because the woman who built it had understood one plain thing that all her wiser neighbors had missed: that cold takes only what you leave within its reach, and that a body who gives it nothing to steal has already half won. Her name was Elspeth Carrow, and she was 34 years old the autumn she stopped believing that another ordinary winter would spare her family. She lived at the ragged eastern edge of the coulee, where the good bottom land gave out, and the sagebrush began on a homestead that had never once turned a real profit and had never once been given up on either. She lived there with her 2 children. Silas was 10 that year, a serious, watchful boy who was beginning too early to carry himself like a man because there was no man left in the house to carry it for him. Etta was 7 small for her age, quick to laugh when there was anything at all to laugh about, and quicker still to fear. Their father had been Tobias Carrow, a builder of the plain and useful kind, the sort of man a valley leans on without ever quite noticing it is leaning. He had set fence posts that did not heave when the frost came into the ground. He had raised barns that stood square and true through the spring gales that flattened lesser work. He had a gift, people said, for keeping weather on the outside of a wall where a man had a right to expect it to stay. He had died of pneumonia 2 winters gone, coughing red into a folded rag, while his wife held his shoulders up off the tick and lied to him gently about how much stronger he sounded that day. And he had believed her, or had let her believe. He believed her, which in the end was the last kindness left between them. No one had ever taught Elspeth Carrow how to build a thing. In that country, a woman was taught to cook and to sew, to doctor a fever and birth a calf, and stretch a barrel of flour across a winter, and those things she knew to the bone. Building was a man's craft, and she had never once held a plumb line or set a stone in her life. But she had watched. For 12 years she had stood at the edge of Tobias's work with a baby balanced on her hip and a dinner pail in her hand, and without ever being told she was being taught anything, she had absorbed the handful of truths that mattered. Water needed somewhere to go always, or it would carve its own road and ruin whatever stood in the way of it. Wind had to be broken and turned before it ever reached the place where people slept, because wind that got inside a wall could not be argued back out of it. A heavy load wanted honest support directly beneath it, set square on something that would not shift. Or sooner or later it came down and took whatever was under it. Tobias had rarely spoken any of this aloud. He had simply done the thing the right way over and over, season after season, until the right way was the only way she could picture in her mind. And now that he was 2 years in the frozen churchyard ground, those silent lessons were nearly the whole of the inheritance he had left her, worth more than the deed to the land or the few dollars in the coffee tin. Though she had not understood that yet. She had begun to understand it the winter before the winter that had come within a breath of taking Etta from her as well. The child had caught a cold in December that would not let go, and by January it had gone down into her small chest and set up house there. Night upon night, Etta coughed until her lips lost their color, and her breath came in thin whistling threads that reached across the dark cabin and woke her mother from the far edge of sleep every time as surely as a hand on the shoulder. Elspeth had fed the stove through those nights until her eyes burned splitting kindling by lamplight when the split wood ran low, and she had watched a whole season's labor of cottonwood and pine dwindle against the cabin wall while the cold went on pooling along the floorboards before every dawn gathering around the beds like something patient and hungry that the fire could push back but never drive off. Nearly the entire winter's woodpile was gone before the deep heart of February had even passed, and the girl still lay burning and shivering by turns. And there were mornings when Elspeth pressed her ear flat against that small chest and could not tell for one endless suspended second whether it still rose and fell at all. Etta had lived, but she had lived through 6 weeks of fever, through blankets heaped on her until she could barely turn beneath their weight, through nights when her mother sat bolt upright in the dark, counting breaths the way a miser counts coin, afraid to sleep for fear the counting would stop. When the aspens along the creek went gold again in the autumn of 1886, and the new woodpile began once more to rise beside the cabin door, Elspeth stood and looked at it one evening and felt no comfort at all, none where a year before the same sight would have eased her, because she understood now in a way she had not before that no quantity of firewood on earth could save a house that would not hold what the fire gave it. Love had kept those vigils. Love had counted the breaths and split the midnight kindling and held the small burning body through the worst of it. And love, she had learned at a price she was still paying, would not carry 2 children through a second Montana winter if the walls of the house itself were quietly conspiring against them the whole time. Her cabin looked proper enough to any eye that passed on the road. It was built of squared logs chinked between with clay and dried grass packed into the gaps, roofed with split shakes, over a layer of tarred canvas, floored with rough planks laid across earth that 3 years of boot heels had tamped nearly to stone. It had a low field stone hearth at the north end and a good iron stove, and it was in every visible particular the same kind of shelter 100 other families in the territory trusted their lives to, trusted precisely because it looked like every cabin that had ever stood through a winter and let its people walk out again alive in the spring. But when the north wind came down the full length of the coulee, with the whole empty roof of the country behind it to lend it weight, the cabin turned to a sieve in her hands. Cold slid up between the floor planks like water finding a crack. Frost crept along the base logs and stood in white ferns by morning. The door shuddered and knocked in its frame all through the black hours, as if something outside were leaning on it, testing it. And when the wind swung around hard to the northwest, the smoke gave up on the chimney altogether and rolled back down into the room in a low, bitter cloud that stung the children's eyes and set Etta coughing again, the very sound Elspeth would have crossed a river of ice to prevent. She had fought it the only way she knew, the ways every homestead woman in that country fought it. She had stuffed rags into every crack she could find with a knife blade. She had hung quilts against the coldest wall until the cabins inside looked like the back of a peddler's cart. She had pressed damp moss by the fistful into the failing chinking and nailed a folded blanket over the window and banked snow against the north wall to the sill. And still, night after night, the house lost heat faster than the stove could manufacture it, a wound in the side of her home that would not close no matter how much of the woodpile she poured into it. So at last, in her exhaustion, she had begun to do a strange thing. She had begun to write down numbers. She kept a ledger, a plain paper account book Tobias had once used to tally lumber and days of work, and in the back of it, where the blank pages were, she began to record the cold. Outside 18 degrees, cabin floor before dawn 29. Hearth still warm to the hand, but the air of the room falling all the same. She wrote these figures by lamplight, while the children slept, not knowing entirely why she did it, only that setting the enemy down in ink made it something she could look at, squarely instead of only endure. And one night beneath a column of those numbers, she wrote a single flat line in her cramped and careful hand that held more quiet despair in it than any weeping could have. The fire works hard, but the room will not keep it. That one sentence changed the whole shape of her nights. Once she had written it, she could not stop seeing it. The room will not keep it. Every hour she spent feeding the stove became in her mind an hour spent carrying water in a cracked bucket, pouring and pouring, while it ran out the bottom faster than she could fill it. The knowledge sat in her chest like a swallowed stone she could not bring back up, and she carried it with her through the short gray days out to the well, in the woodpile, in the barn, turning it over, finding no way around it. It was on one of those errands late in October that the barn told her its secret. She had crossed the frozen yard after supper to look in on the animals. Before dark, the wind cutting across her face like a drawn razor, the whole distance from the cabin door, so that she came into the barn with her eyes watering and her cheeks stiff. But the moment she hauled the heavy plank door shut behind her, and the wind's teeth were on the far side of it, the air changed against her skin. Not warm. She did not want to overstate it even to herself, and it was not warm the way a room with a good fire is warm. It was something quieter and steadier than warmth. It was air that did not lunge and did not retreat, air that simply sat holding a temperature of its own that had nothing to do with the killing cold 10 feet away outside the boards. The three horses stood dozing in their stalls, their big bodies giving off a slow, patient animal heat into the dark. The old mule breathed softly near the back wall with its long ears at ease for once. Above them, all the oat straw loft sat thick and dry, packed nearly to the roof beams, holding the warmth up against the underside of the roof, the way a folded quilt holds the shape and heat of the body that slept under it. And along the whole north side where Tobias had banked earth against the foundation sill years ago, and never troubled to explain why the worst of the winds struck the packed dirt and broke and slid away without ever reaching the floor where she stood. Elspeth pulled off one glove to retie a halter that had worked loose on the near horse, and her bare fingers out here in an unheated barn on a night the thermometer would soon put below zero did not go numb. Such a small thing, such an ordinary, unremarkable, everyday thing, a woman's bare hand not aching with cold in a barn. But it lodged in her the way the flat line in the ledger had lodged, and it would not be set aside. She stood very still with the halter rope in her fingers and looked down at the packed dirt floor and up at the black weight of straw overhead and across at the animals shifting and blowing in the last gray light that came through the gaps in the boards. And something deep in her mind turned slowly over and came to rest in a wholly new position, the way a key-long jam finally turns. The barn was not making much heat at all. She saw that plainly. 3 horses and 1 old mule could not warm a whole barn against a Montana night by their breath alone. The barn was doing something else entirely. The barn was keeping what little heat it was given. The cabin, for all its stove and its hearth and its walls of good squared log, lost heat faster than it could ever make it. The barn with no fire in it at all held, and a family she understood in that instant with a clarity that frightened her more than it gladdened her did not need a house that could make a great deal of heat. A family needed a place that would flatly refuse to let heat go. She did not sleep at all that night. She lay in the failing cabin with the 2 children breathing on either side of her and listened to the door knock and shudder in its frame. And for the first time in 2 years, that sound did not fill her with dread. It filled her instead with arithmetic. The next morning she carried 3 things out to the barn while the children still slept a length of twine. A folding carpenter's rule that had ridden in Tobias's coat pocket to 100 jobs and still smelled faintly of him when she opened it, and a stub of charcoal for marking. And she began in the cold gray light to measure in silence. She would not build against the stalls where the animal's waste brought damp and a heavy stink that had no business anywhere near a child's sleeping place. She would not build near the wide double doors at the south end where every winter gust forced its way in the instant the latch was lifted and where the drifts would pile deepest. She marked out her ground instead, directly beneath the deepest part of the oat loft in the center of the barn, where the earth underfoot rang firm and solid when she struck it with her heel, and where the roof carried its heaviest blanket of straw overhead to hold the warmth down. 9 feet wide, 13 feet long, 6 feet and 8 inches down into the cold clay of the coulee, deep enough that a woman could stand upright in it, and a grown man would not have to stoop. Enough room when it was finished for a rope bed and 2 small pallets, a narrow plank shelf, a lamp, and a water crock. And one weathered trunk to hold every possession the three of them owned that was worth the holding. She wrote the figures in the ledger, and beside them, she wrote the one word the whole thing turned upon, and she circled it twice and underlined it until the charcoal nearly tore through the paper dry. It was not a root cellar. She was careful alone in her own mind to refuse that word because the word would make people think they understood the thing when they did not. A root cellar was a hole a man scraped out to keep his potatoes and his turnips from freezing solid, and it did not matter in the least to a potato whether the air around it was damp. Damp was the death of people, not of potatoes. And it was not a dugout either. Not the raw, wretched scrape in a hillside that a family lived in their first hard year on the land and were quietly ashamed of ever after once they had a proper cabin to move into. It was neither of those things. It was a sleeping room built beneath a working barn, engineered, though she did not know that word, to catch and store and hold the heat that rose off living animals and the fire she would build, and it would be a fit place for her children, or it would be nothing at all. And the whole difference between those two outcomes came down to that one underlined word. Cold a body could endure. Cold could be layered against with wool and burned back with a fire and simply slept through if a person had heat enough banked to see the night out. But the wet was another kind of enemy entirely. Wet soaked into blankets and would not leave them. Wet crept into stacked timber and into stored grain and into the small, vulnerable lungs of a 7-year-old child who had very nearly died of exactly that the winter before, and once it was in, it stayed, and it worked its slow, patient ruin in the dark. A warm room that was also a wet room, she set down in the ledger that morning, is only a slower way to lose them, and the fool who built it will believe he is winning right up until the end. She wrote it once plainly, and then she closed the book because a thing understood did not need saying twice. The plan was neither bold nor beautiful, and she harbored no illusions about either. It would be brutal, backbreaking work to build, and worse than brutal to explain to a single living soul, and she knew without having to ask that the coulee, when it found out, would decide with one voice that grief had finally cracked her judgment clean through. She turned the whole shape of the thing over one last time in the lamplight, hunting deliberately for the place where her reasoning failed the fatal flaw that would send her and the children to their deaths in a frozen hole. She did not find it. The idea held. And then from the far corner of the cabin where she had bedded the girl down for the night, Etta coughed once in her sleep, that small, dry catching sound that lived now in the deepest cellar of her mother's fear, and Elspeth closed the ledger and set it on the shelf and let the last of her hesitation go out of her like a held breath. Whatever looked proper to the neighbors had no claim on her any longer. Only the thing that kept her children breathing until the spring thaw had any claim on her at all, and it was a total one. There was one matter she had not counted on, and it announced itself before she had turned the first shovelful of clay. Silas had woken early that second morning, quiet as he always was, and Silas had heard. Not all of it, but enough. A fragment of her low muttering as she read the figures back to herself, or a glimpse of the marks on the barn floor, or the underlined word in the open ledger. Some piece of it had reached him. He said nothing over the porridge, but she caught him watching her across the table with an expression she knew and hated to see on so young a face, the careful sidelong look of a child who has begun far too soon to worry about the sanity of the one grown person left to keep him safe. When she sent him off to the schoolhouse, he went slowly, dragging his feet in the frozen ruts, and at the fence line he stopped and looked back once at the barn, a long, searching look, and that single backward glance told her plainly that the trouble had already put on its boots and begun to walk beyond her fence on its own legs. A widow talking to herself about digging a hole beneath her horses was a story the coulee would carry a very long way, And Silas at 10 was old enough to understand that, old enough to feel the shame of it settle across his thin shoulders before a single neighbor had yet spoken a word. Etta carried a different weight, smaller and closer to the bone of her. The child was afraid of the dark that lived beneath things, of the black square of the cabin's own cellar hatch, of the shadowed gap under the porch where the barn cats slunk away to have their kittens. When Elspeth explained to her, gently kneeling to her level, what sort of room she meant to make down in the ground, the girl's eyes went wide and did not blink. "You want us to sleep in the dirt," she said, and it was not quite a question, and there was no answer her mother could give that did not sound to a frightened 7-year-old uncomfortably like a description of a grave with the family still in it. Elspeth had taken the small cold hands in both of hers and said only that she herself would go down first and stay down every night, and that no darkness her own mother chose to sit inside of could ever be the kind of darkness that would hurt her. The child had not been convinced, not truly. But she had stopped shaking, and for the first day of the labor, that was as much peace as any promise could buy. So the digging began in the raw first mornings of November, in the hour before the light, when the frost lay heaviest after the animals were fed, and before she woke the children, and again in the short afternoons, while Silas minded his sister by the cabin stove. The coulee did not give up its ground to a woman with a spade. The first foot came up as dense yellow clay packed so tight by 10,000 seasons of freeze and thaw that it was nearer to soft stone than to soil, and it had to be broken loose in fist-sized chunks before it could be lifted at all. Beneath that lay a treacherous bed of scattered rock, and through the whole of it ran the dry, stubborn, woody roots of the sagebrush, thick as a man's finger, that caught every downward swing of the mattock and jarred the tool back up her arms into her shoulders and rattled her teeth in her head. Her instruments were few and honest, the tools of a homestead widow and not a mining company. A spade worn thin and bright at the edge. A mattock with a cracked helve she had wrapped and bound with wet rawhide that shrank tight as it dried. A dented tin bucket, and a loop of old hay rope gone smooth and gray with years of use, on which she hauled the loosened earth up out of the deepening pit, one heavy bucket at a time, through a temporary opening she had cut and hinged in the barn floor. She could not simply heap the diggings behind the barn where any eye could find them. A growing mound of fresh, yellow clay was a question that any rider passing on the freight road could read at a single glance, and questions were the one commodity she could least afford just then. So she carried the spoil out in the dark, bucket by bucket, on a wooden stone boat she dragged behind her, and she spread it thin and low across the shallow depressions, behind the barn where the spring runoff always gathered and stood in stagnant sheets, working each load into the sunken ground with the back of the spade, until from the road, from any distance at all, not one thing looked disturbed. It doubled her labor, and it halved what little sleep she got, and she did it every single night without fail, because a secret half kept was a secret already lost, and this one had to hold until the winter itself could stand up and speak in its defense. Silas she permitted to carry only the lightest of the buckets, the ones already hauled to the surface from the hatch to the stone boat, and no farther. She would not let him near the pit itself, and never, not once, would she allow him to climb down into it. He asked to, of course, being 10 years old and proud and desperate to shoulder a man's fair portion of a thing that so plainly frightened his mother. She refused him every time, and she refused him harder than the asking seemed to warrant, until he stopped asking and went sullen about it. She could not make herself explain the true reason, which was that the walls of raw clay were not yet secured, and that loose earth gave no warning at all before it let go that a bank could stand solid for a week, and then slump in a heartbeat and bury whatever stood below it. She had already laid one member of this family down in the cold ground with her own 2 hands, standing dry-eyed at the churchyard because there was no one to spare her tears for. And she would not. She would sooner die herself, dig a second grave in her own barn, and have her only son inside it. So she let the refusal sting him. She watched it sting him, watched him turn away with his jaw set and his eyes bright, and she let it stand because a bruised pride healed clean in a boy and grew back stronger, and a boy crushed under a wall of falling clay did not heal at all. The ground itself very nearly proved her right, and sooner than she would have liked. On a bitter morning in the second week, with the pit already better than 4 feet deep, she drove the mattock into the north face and felt rather than heard a wrongness, a soft shifting groan in the packed clay above her head. She flung herself flat back against the opposite wall on instinct alone, and a slab of the north bank the size of a wagon door peeled away and came down where she had been standing with a heavy, wet thud that she felt come up through the soles of her boots. When the dust settled, she was unhurt, pressed flat and gasping against the cold clay, her heart going like a trapped bird, and she stood there a long moment in the half-dark of the pit and understood exactly how close the thing had come and exactly what would have become of two children left alone in that cabin, with their mother lying still under a fallen wall, and no living soul knowing to come and dig. She did not tell Silas. She climbed out shaking, and she spent the whole of that afternoon cutting and setting rough planks shoring against the walls, bracing the raw earth with salvaged boards and stout willow poles before she would let herself take up the spade again. Some lessons the country taught only once and charged a life for the second telling. Some mornings her palms were blistered raw and bleeding before the sun had even cleared the eastern ridge. By evening, her back had set into a single bar of iron ache that no amount of lying down would ease, and the clay had worked so deep beneath her fingernails that no scrubbing at the wash basin would bring it out, so that she took to church with clay-stained hands and let the good women think what they liked of a widow who could not keep herself clean. She spoke of the work to no one beyond her own two children. Every bucket of earth she hauled up into the gray light was a promise made in a silence so complete that only the ledger ever heard it. Down another 4 inches, she would write by lamplight. North wall shored. The words were plain because the labor was plain, and each inch she carried up out of that ground moved her family one step further from the life that had already once come within a single held breath of failing to save them. The valley found her out well before she had finished the digging exactly as she had known in her bones it would. Gideon Ashford, whose land ran up hard against the northern boundary of the Carrow homestead, and whose good opinion carried weight at the meeting house, came riding home along the freight road one gray afternoon in his heavy buffalo coat, with his collar turned up against the wind, and he saw the widow crossing her yard with a bundle of folded bedding pressed to her chest. She was carrying it not toward the cabin where bedding belonged, but into the horse barn. He reined his mount to a walk for a moment, and he looked, and then he touched his heels to the animal's flanks and rode on because it was cold and getting colder, and it was no affair of his, and because a man of any decency did not stop on the road to question a widow woman about the strange handling of her own wash. He meant nothing unkind by riding on. That was the whole trouble with what came after. He meant nothing unkind at all. But that evening, over his own hot supper in his own warm house, the picture would not leave him be, and he mentioned it to his wife the way a man mentions a small thing that has snagged itself on the edge of his mind and will not come free. His wife, who meant no harm either, mentioned it in turn to her married sister 2 days later. And by the next Sunday gathering at the little clapboard meeting house at the head of the coulee, the story had grown itself a set of legs and a knowing face. Verna Applewhite, who taught the Valley's children their letters and their sums in the one-room schoolhouse, and who prided herself, without quite admitting it, on knowing a thing, before it was fully true, paused with the coffee pot tilted over a cup, and her eyebrows lifted. "She's taken to sleeping out in the barn," they say she offered, and the words hung and spread in the warm, crowded room. "Not in it," a second woman answered lower, leaning in with the particular unmistakable relish of a person about to deliver the very worst version of a rumor. "Under it." The room went quiet in the way that rooms do when pity and unease arrive together in the doorway, and neither one is quite sure which ought to speak first. After a moment, someone let out a long breath and said kindly that Tobias Carrow's passing must have struck the poor woman a great deal harder than any of them had rightly guessed, that grief did strange and terrible things to a mind left alone through 2 long winters, with no man's steadying hand upon the tiller. No one laughed. That was somehow the crueler thing, that no one laughed. Laughter she could have met and answered and stared down. But pity closed over her name in that room like slow dark water closing over a stone, silent and total, and there was no arguing a thing back up out of water. Within a fortnight, the whole coulee had a name for her, a name the children carried home from the schoolyard, and the men muttered over their coffee at the feed store. A name that fixed her in the valley's imagination as surely and as permanently as a brand burned into a hide. The barn-buried woman. It reached the schoolyard the way every cruelty in the history of the world has reached a schoolyard, through the careless mouth of a child who did not truly understand the weight of the thing he carried. A big, red-faced boy wrinkled his nose at Silas across the frozen play yard one noon and announced loud enough that every other child heard it that the Carrow place stank of horses, that Silas himself stank of horses, that everyone knew. Now he slept down in the muck with the animals like something born wild that had never seen the inside of a Christian house. Silas said nothing at all. He had his mother's own hard habit of silence, and he wore it that afternoon like a coat cut 3 sizes too large for him, swallowing him. He walked the whole cold mile home without a single word to anyone, kicked once hard at the frozen dirt outside the barn door, and climbed straight down the ladder into the half-finished room in the ground to sit alone in the dark where no one living could see his face. Elspeth found him there an hour later and did not ask him what was wrong. She knew the exact shape of the wound already, and she knew that questions would only pull it wider. She climbed down and sat beside him on the cold damp floor, with the lantern between them, throwing their 2 shadows huge against the raw clay wall. And after a long while, she said the only true and useful thing she had. They can call it whatever they need to call it, Silas. It costs them nothing, and it changes nothing. The winter is the only judge whose ruling I mean to answer to, and the winter has not spoken yet. The boy did not reply, and she had not expected him to. But after a moment, he leaned just a fraction sideways against her shoulder, the way he had not let himself lean since his father died, and he stayed there in the lantern light until the flame had burned low and guttered, and that was answer enough, and more than she had hoped for. The warnings when they came did not come as mockery, and that was precisely what made them so hard to lay aside. They came from the 2 men in the whole coulee whose words carried the most quiet weight, and they came out of real concern, and every plain sentence of them was true. Levi Stroud kept the general store at the crossroads, a low log building that smelled of coffee and coal oil and new leather, and it was to Levi that Elspeth had gone for lamp oil and a coil of stovepipe, and the short, mismatched sections of 6-inch clay drain tile she needed for her venting. He fetched down what she asked for, and then he set his broad, flat hands on the counter and did not at once ring up her purchase, in the manner of a man arranging his conscience, before he lets it out into the open air. "I've sold clay tile to folks before now, Ms. Carrow," he said, and there was not one grain of meanness in it, only the settled weight of a thing he had watched happen with his own eyes. "There was a family up the North Fork few years back, built themselves a right fine cellar with it. Looked sound clear through the fall, tight as a drum. Then the spring thaw come and the water come in with it right up through the floor, and their whole crop of potatoes rotted black in the bins. And worse than that, their little ones coughed the damp out of their chests near a month after all 3 of them." He met her eyes steadily across the counter. "I'd sooner not sell a thing that puts a widow's babies into that same fix. That's all. I'll sell it to you if you want it, but I'd not be easy in myself if I didn't say the once." She thanked him for the concern, and she meant the thanks because the concern was real and rare, and she knew its worth. She told him only that she had built for the water, that she had given it a road of its own to run down and a place of its own to gather and fall away, and that she was not afraid of the thaw. She offered him nothing further, no diagram, no accounting of her drain pocket and her slope floor. She had learned at some cost that the more a person explains, the more they only invite the whole world to sit down and argue the point, and she had no argument left in her to spend on anyone at all but the frost. The second warning carried further and cut deeper because it came from Ezra Coleman. And Ezra Coleman had outlasted more Montana winters than any man still drawing breath in the coulee. He was past 70 and hard as a fence post, and he had buried neighbors and then rebuilt their cabins with his own hands for the widows they left behind. He had watched blizzards break men far stronger and far surer of themselves than he had ever been. When he came upon Elspeth at her woodpile one afternoon with the splitting maul in her hands, he did not dismount from his old roan, and he did not trouble to soften a word of it. "I hear you've put your children down under the ground," he said. "Beneath the barn," she answered, and set another round on the block and split it clean. He nodded slowly the way a man nods at a thing he has already decided in his heart he does not like. "Damp ground ruins lungs. I have watched it do it more than the once. Freeze and thaw will shift a wall a man swore on his life could never be moved, and it will do it in the black heart of February when there's no getting to it to fix it. He let that settle a moment in the cold air between them. And smoke in a closed room with no proper draw will kill a whole family stone dead in their sleep before a single one of them ever wakes to smell it. Every word of it was reasonable. Every word of it had happened somewhere to someone within the long reach of his own memory, and he set the words down between them one at a time, like stones laid on a grave. She rested the maul head down on the block and looked at him full and level. I have built the drainage, Mr. Coleman. The chamber vents clean out the leeward side, and I have tested the draw of it with my own two eyes. She said it steady and quiet without any heat in it, because heat would have sounded to a man like his to be doubt dressed up as certainty. Ezra looked past her toward the barn, but he did not ride so much as a step nearer to it, as though the strangeness of the thing might somehow be catching. After a long silence, he set both weathered hands on the horn of his saddle and gave her the only verdict he had it in him to give. Maybe. Then he lifted his gaze past her to the hard gray weight of the northern sky, where the light had taken on that flat, dull pewter color that old men in that country had learned across long lifetimes to distrust and to fear. Winter will measure it, he said. That's all. Winter measures everything out here sooner or later, and it don't much care what any of us believe going in. He touched the brim of his hat to her civil to the last, and turned the old roan and rode away up the freight road, and she watched him go without any insult rising in her, because she understood exactly what he had meant, and because in the whole of it she agreed with every word. The storm would not care in the least what she believed. The storm would care only for what held and what did not. But the Coulee had one voice that did not stop at honest concern, one voice that took the whole matter and turned it in a single hard afternoon from a grieving widow's private eccentricity into a standing threat against her right to keep her own children. The Reverend Amos Rourke rode a preaching circuit of 3 scattered settlements and gave the sermon in the clapboard meeting house every second Sunday, and he had taken it upon himself in the years since Tobias Carrow was laid in the ground to keep a shepherd's watchful eye on the fatherless of his flock. He was not a cruel man in his own understanding of himself. He believed himself to be a merciful one, which in some men is a far more dangerous thing to be. He came upon Elspeth at the store the very week she had gone in for the last of her stovepipe, and he did not trouble to lower his voice when he addressed her, because he did not hold that a rebuke ought to be delivered in private if the sin it named was being committed out in the public view. A woman who put her babies down to sleep in the raw earth beneath dumb animals. He said there, in the plain hearing of Levi Stroud and 2 other customers, was a woman who had allowed her grief to carry her clear past the outer edge of sound judgment. There were families in this valley, he went on, godly families with proper roofs over proper beds, who would gladly take in 2 motherless-hearted children and raise them up in the light and warmth of a Christian home. It would be a mercy, he said, and he said the word mercy the way another sort of man might have slid a knife from its sheath. It would be a mercy to give the matter serious thought before the deep cold came down, and the whole bitter consequence of her stubbornness fell not upon the guilty, but upon the innocent. Elspeth stood very still while he spoke. She was aware of Levi Stroud gone motionless and unhappy behind his counter, of the frost creeping its white ferns up the corners of the window glass, of her own heart striking hard and slow and steady against her ribs like a fist against a closed door. The Reverend had not threatened her wall or her drainage or the draw of her flue. He had threatened to take her children away from her. And she understood in that one suspended and terrible moment that the valley's soft pity had curdled at last into something with teeth in it, and that she was no longer racing only against the frost and the thaw and the smoke. She was racing now against the day, a man of the cloth, with the whole considerable weight of the settlement's good opinion gathered behind him, would decide that Silas and Etta belonged at some other family's hearth than their own mother's. She did not weep, and she did not raise her voice, because either one would have been taken by every soul in that store as proof of exactly what he had just said of her. She looked the Reverend square in the eye, and she spoke, pitching her voice low enough that he had to still his own breathing to catch the whole of it. My husband kept the weather out of every house he ever raised in this valley, Reverend, and there are men warm in their beds tonight because of his hands. I mean to finish the one last thing he would have been proudest of me for, and I mean to do it with his 2 children warm and dry and breathing easy on the far side of it. You may come and see the work with your own eyes. When it is done, and welcome. But until that day, you will not stand in a public store and speak of my babies as though they were yours to hand out." Then she gathered up her stovepipe and her clay tile into her arms and walked out into the cold. And she did not let her hands begin to shake until the barn door was shut fast behind her, and there was no child anywhere near to see it. That night she stood a long while at the mouth of the unfinished room, the lantern throwing her shadow tall and wavering against the raw clay wall, and she made herself count over one by one the true enemies she was fighting. There was the wind which stole the heat from any door or crack or seam it could reach a cold finger into. There was the water which had to be given a road of its own to travel, or it would carve one straight through her work. There was the smoke which needed an honest path up and out, or it would come looking patient and lethal for the lungs of the very people she was trying to save. And now there was this last enemy, the coldest of the four, in its own quiet way, the settled judgment of decent, kindly, God-fearing people who had already looked at her love and decided that from the outside it had the shape of neglect. 4 adversaries ranged against her, and only the last of them had a human face she could reason with. And it was the last of them she trusted the least, because the wind and the water and the smoke at least obeyed laws she could learn and answer, and the hearts of frightened neighbors obeyed no law at all. She went down the ladder into the pit and set the lantern on the shelf stone she had let into the western wall, and she stood among the beginnings of the thing that Tobias would have understood at a single glance. The lean of the first stone course canted just so back into the earth, the gentle fall she had begun to work into the floor. It was crude yet, and unfinished and cold, and it smelled of raw clay and lamp oil. But it was hers, made wholly of her own 2 hands, and her own long-hoarded memory, and her dead husband's silent teaching. And looking at it there in the small circle of lantern light, she felt rise in her chest the first thing in 2 full years that she was willing to give the name of hope. Etta came to the top of the ladder that same night in her nightdress and bare feet drawn down through the cold barn by the glow of the lamp, the way the barn cats were drawn to any warmth in the dark, and she peered over the edge into the pit where her mother stood among the stones. The child's old fear had not left her, not entirely, but curiosity had begun at last to war against it, and curiosity in a 7-year-old is a stubborn and relentless general who wins most of the battles he chooses to fight. "Are we going to live like foxes?" she asked, and her small voice went thin and uncertain on the last word, half afraid of whatever the answer might turn out to be. Elspeth looked up at her daughter's pale face, hung there in the square of lantern light above her, and for the first time in more weeks than she could rightly count, she smiled, and she meant it all the way through. "Foxes stay alive through the hardest winters there are," she said, "because they know exactly where the wind cannot reach them, and they go there and they let the world howl itself out overhead. That is the whole of what we are doing down here, my girl. We are learning where the wind cannot reach, and then we are going there." And Etta, turning this slowly over in her solemn mind, seemed to decide that a fox, after all, was a thing she could bear to be, a clever, warm thing safe in its den. And she came down 3 rungs of the ladder in her bare feet to stand beside her mother in the warm circle of light, no longer looking down into a grave, but into a burrow, which is a different thing entirely, and made all the difference in the world. November closed its hard fist around the coulee. The mornings came in the color of iron and stayed gray all through the short days, and the light that filtered through the barn boards grew thin and brief and grudging. Elspeth worked on with the mattock and the spade until her hands cracked open and bled into the rawhide wrapping of the helve, and she wound rags around her palms and worked on anyway. The pit reached its full and proper depth on a morning when the water in the horse trough wore a skin of ice, thick enough to bear the weight of a barn cat walking across it, and she stood at last at the bottom of the 9 by 13 hole she had carved single-handed out of ground that had never once wanted to be a room, and she understood that the digging at least was finished. Now came the far harder half of the work. Now she had to make the thing hold against the water and against the cold and against the gathering judgment of men. And she had until the first true killing storm to do it, with no earthly way of knowing when that storm would choose to come down out of the north and put the whole of her answer to the question. She climbed the ladder up into the gray barn light, and the 3 horses turned their long heads to watch her come, and the old mule blew a great cloud of breath into the cold. and above them all the vast dark weight of the oat straw waited on its beams, holding its warmth up against the roof, the way it always had, patient and indifferent as the earth itself. Elspeth set down her tools against the wall and looked at what she had made, and at all she had yet to make of it, and she thought of Ezra Coleman's flat gray verdict, and of the Reverend's drawn word mercy, and of the name the whole valley had hung round her neck. Let them measure me by what looks proper, she thought, and reached for the ledger to set down the depth. The winter would measure her by something else entirely, and the winter she had long since decided was the only judge in all the world whose ruling she meant to answer to. The stone came out of the South Wash in slabs that no single woman on earth had any business lifting, and Elspeth lifted them regardless, one at a punishing time, rolling the most stubborn of them end over end across the frozen ground when her arms gave out on the carrying of them. She hauled creek shale up out of the draw below the homestead on the stone boat, and she gathered flat gray field rock off the slope beyond the barn where the plow had turned it up for years, and not one piece of any of it was handsome. Some slabs came thin and treacherous and ready to shear clean in two under a bad load. Others sat heavy and graceless and dead better rolled than ever raised. But weight was the entire point of them, and weight set in the right place in the right way was very nearly the only advantage she had over a country that had made up its mind to freeze her out, provided always that she remembered exactly what Tobias had told her years back, about how a dry-laid wall was meant to stand. He had told her on a summer afternoon she had not known she was memorizing that a stacked stone wall must never be built to rise stiff and plumb and proud like a fence rail. That a fence was a thing meant chiefly to be looked at, and a wall was a thing meant only to hold, and that the two had almost nothing in common beyond the name. A wall face laid dead vertical, he had said, had nothing but its own friction to keep it from bellying slowly outward under the endless patient press of the earth banked behind it, and friction given time enough and cold enough always lost that argument in the end. A wall wanted instead a slight deliberate inward lean about her, so that the whole standing weight of the stone leaned back into the very bank of earth it was fighting, and used the downward pull of the world itself to marry each stone the more tightly to the one below it, instead of forever prying them apart. She had watched him build in just that way a dozen times or more, without ever once being told that she was watching a lesson she would one day need to save her children's lives. Now that half-remembered lesson was the only wall standing between her family and the February dark. So she set each course of stone with a care that made the work crawl along at a snail's slow pace. Broad face turned down for a stable seat that would not rock. The long axis of each stone driven back into the bank to tie the visible face to the fill behind it, so that the wall became one thing and not two. Every gap between the larger stones chinked and wedged tight with smaller chips knocked to fit, until no single rock in the whole of it could shift so much as a hair under the pressure of a shoving hand. Behind the rising face, she packed a backing of clay worked all through with chopped straw, tamping it down in thin patient layers with the flat end of a fence post until the loose spoil behind could no longer crumble forward into the chamber and undo in one careless afternoon the whole of a morning's labor. The straw and the clay was Tobias's trick once more dredged up out of memory from the day years back that she had watched him daub the smokehouse and thought nothing of it. The straw gave the clay 1,000 small fibers to grip and knit around the way. A rope of many twisted strands holds fast under a load that would snap any single strand in two. She had never once understood watching him why he troubled with it. She understood it now with every single course she laid, felt the difference in her own hands, the way clay with straw in it held its face, and clay without it slumped and cracked. The floor came after the walls had climbed to the height of her waist. She tamped the yellow clay of the chamber bottom until it rang solid under the striking post, and would take the full drop of a boot heel without so much as denting. But she did not tamp it flat and level whatever her eye might have preferred to see. A level floor was a tidy thing, and a tidy thing was a useless one where water was concerned, for water had never in the history of the world respected tidiness. She worked instead a gentle, deliberate fall into the whole surface of it, tipping the floor a finger's width across every foot of its length toward the far southwest corner. And there in that lowest corner, she dug a drain pocket, the better part of 18 inches deep, and lined it carefully with creek pebbles. cold sifted hearth ash, and a loose bundle of dry willow twigs cut from the draw. Any seep of water that ever found its slow way into the room would now run quietly downhill to that corner and vanish away into the gravel of the pocket, instead of spreading itself in a cold, thin sheet across the floor beneath the pallets where a child would sleep. She stood back at last and studied the invisible tilt of the thing she had made and understood better than she had ever understood it before, that a warm room by itself was not nearly enough. Warmth without dryness was a trap that closed slowly. She was proven right about the water a good deal sooner than she would have chosen. A cold rain came sweeping down the coulee in the middle of November, the kind of raw, driving autumn soak that finds out every seam a builder ever left open. And on the morning after it, Elspeth carried her lantern down the ladder to read whatever the weather had chosen to tell her in the night. She stopped 2 rungs from the bottom and held the lantern up. A dark stain marked the western face of the wall, low down where the stone met the packed floor, no wider across than her own spread hand. No water dripped from it. Nothing about it gave off any smell of rot or standing wet. A great many people she knew would have glanced at so small and quiet a mark, judged it nothing, and climbed back up the ladder well satisfied with themselves. And she felt in her own tired chest the strong, sweet pull of exactly that easy relief. The soft, insistent whisper at the back of her mind that said surely it was nothing that she had done enough, that she had earned the right to leave one small thing be. She did not listen to the whisper. She had learned at a price she was paying still, and would go on paying precisely what a small, quiet wet mark grew into once the winter got its hands upon it. If that wall would drink a hand's width of a single autumn rain, then it would drink a whole cold river come the spring, when the deep snow banked above it began to turn to melt and go looking for somewhere lower to be, and by that time her children would be sleeping with their backs to it. So she climbed straight back up into the raw cold, and she peeled away the clay backing behind the stained section of wall with her bare fingers, going stiff and white, and she cut a shallow diversion trench in a long curving arc around the whole western flank of the barn, so that any runoff coming down the slope in the melt would be turned gently aside to circle wide around the foundation, rather than gather and stand and press against it. Then she mixed a fresh batch of clay with wood ash and chopped straw, and forced it back into the open seam of the wall, driving each handful home hard with the heel of her palm until the joint was packed tighter than it had ever been in the first building of it, before she went out and rebuilt the outer bank of earth over the top of the whole repair. Inside, she pressed a strip of old worn linen flat against the dark mark on the wall and left it hanging there through the night as a silent witness. She came down before the animals the next dawn and peeled the cloth carefully away, and she held her own breath while she unfolded it in the shaking lantern light. It was not clean, but it was dry all the way through. The stain had stopped its slow spreading, arrested, and turned back at the very place where she had caught it. Silas, who had followed her down the ladder and stood watching at her shoulder, asked in a small voice whether something had gone wrong with the wall, whether the whole thing was going to fail. She shook her head once and folded the dry linen away into her coat. Only a place that asked a question, she told him, and got its answer. A wall that never asks you anything at all is a wall that is already lying to you, Silas. It is the quiet ones that drown you in the spring. This one spoke up in time, and I heard it, and now it will hold. She marked the ledger in the failing dawn light in 3 plain words. West Corner answered. There was no celebration anywhere in the line. There was only confidence, the slow and dearly bought kind, and the plain hard knowledge that every single weakness she uncovered and closed before the winter came was one weakness the storm would never get its chance to find on its own. The ceiling was the thing that frightened her the most of all, waking and sleeping, because the ceiling had to carry the whole weight of the world above it. There was no wall she could stack, however true, that would matter a straw if the roof of the chamber gave way in the night, and above that roof stood 3 heavy horses. One old mule, the full dead, crushing weight of 9 feet of stored oat straw, and the constant daily traffic of a working barn through the whole long labor of a Montana winter. She walked out one gray afternoon to the ruin of the old wagon shed that had gone down in the spring gale. The tangled wreck, the whole coulee had already written off long ago as so much firewood waiting to be split, and she looked at it the way Tobias would have looked at it, seeing clean past the rot and the ruin to the good bones still standing inside it. The split and weathered ends of the timbers were spoiled past saving true enough, but the hearts of the main beams were still sound. Seasoned, dense old wood with years of honest load-bearing left in them. And lumber of that quality did not come cheap to a homestead widow, nor come to her at all in any other way. She sawed away the ruined ends where she could get her handsaw to bite, and she dragged each salvaged timber back across the frozen yard to the barn, one heavy load at a time, the hay rope biting deep into her shoulder, the beams scoring a long dark furrow through the crust of frost behind her the whole way. When she came at last to seat them over the chamber, she laid the main members across the pit at a hard right angle to the run of the barn's own floor joists overhead, crossing the load instead of running along beneath it. Tobias had explained that principle to her exactly once, standing under the half-raised frame of a granary he was building for a neighbor in one of the few moments of his life when he had put a plain reason into plain words. A beam laid the same way the load runs above it, he had said, carries that whole load down in a single narrow line and does nothing but wait its turn to fail. But a beam laid crossways to the grain of the load spreads the burden wide and shares it out among many separate bearings so that no one single point along its length ever has to hold more than it is able. She had not fully grasped it that summer day. She grasped it now to the marrow, seating each crossing timber into a shallow pocket she had cut into the very stone of the chamber walls, so that the whole ceiling would not hang on the doubtful mercy of nails, but would rest in the last accounting on solid stone itself. Above those cross beams, the animals could stamp and shift, and the straw could settle, and the daily chores could go on forever, and the room below would neither know nor care. Then she made the way into the room, and she made it above all to disappear. Not an outside door which would only gather a hard drift against its threshold and let the cold pour in beneath it every single time it was opened. Not a stairwell open to the sky which would have stood like a chimney turned upside down, funneling the frost straight down into the heart of the chamber. Not even a plain hatch that a passing eye might happen to catch and wonder at. She built a rectangular opening barely 32 inches by 38 set beneath the standing oat storage bin, and she fitted its planks so close and true to the surrounding floorboards of the barn, matched them so near in grain and in weathered color and in wear that a grown man crossing the barn floor above would read the whole of it as nothing more than the ordinary plank bottom of the feed bin he happened to be standing beside. She lowered it into place, stepped back, and searched the floor with her own eyes for the seam of the thing she had built with her own hands, and could not at a glance find it. The wind, she understood, standing over the vanished door in the dim barn light, could not steal warmth from a threshold that it was never once given the chance to touch. But a hidden room in the ground held more than heat within its walls, and it was the other thing it held, the thing she had feared from the very first, that came within a hair of killing her son. She had known long before she ever struck the first match down there that a sealed chamber beneath a barn could keep smoke as faithfully as it kept warmth. And that smoke was not even the worst of what a poorly drawing fire could breed in a closed room. There was a poison in bad flame, an invisible thing that carried no smell at all and gave no warning whatsoever, that let a whole family drift gently down into a sleep from which not one of them ever climbed back up, and the very thought of it had made her cautious to the point of dread. So she had fitted her cheap mismatched lengths of clay tile carefully through a cavity built into the wall and angled the whole run of it out the leeward side of the barn, where the mouth of it, dressed over with a scrap of gray board, looked like nothing more remarkable in all the world than the vent of a feed room. Her firebox was as humble as the pipe that served it, a small clay-lined box set low into the corner, built to take no more than a handful of split kindling and a few narrow sticks of cottonwood at a time. Nothing grand, nothing hungry, nothing that might roar and overwhelm the modest draw of her homemade flue. On the first trial, the fire did not draw. It caught in the box well enough, and then it hesitated, and then it gave up entirely on the cold flue above it and spread instead low and flat across the whole chamber in a gray, bitter, creeping curtain that stung the eyes and caught raw in the throat. Silas, standing too near at his mother's side to watch, coughed once, and then again harder, and then could not stop, and the sound of it drove a spike of the old winter terror straight through Elspeth's chest, the exact terror she had built the whole room to end forever. She snatched the burning sticks up out of the box with the iron tongs and plunged them hissing into a waiting bucket of ash in a single unbroken motion, flung the hidden hatch wide with her free hand, and half carried, half hauled the coughing boy up the ladder into the barn's clean cold air with a strength she had not known was in her. She stood him against the stall boards and held his shoulders, and watched his heaving chest until the coughing at last eased and his breath came clear again. And only then, only after, did she let herself feel the full crushing weight of what had nearly happened in that room. She had dug and stacked and built a chamber in the earth to save her two children from the cold. And the chamber, on its very first trial, had reached out with her own carefully laid fire and tried to take one of them from her. She did not weep, and she did not for one moment think of quitting. She went back down the ladder when the bad air had cleared, and she read the failure exactly the way she read every failure, as a hard question the work itself had put to her and was waiting on her to answer. The problem was the draft she saw plainly, the cold, dead-standing column of heavy air filling the flue that her small, modest fire simply had not the strength to lift and set moving. So she rebuilt the whole vent. She added a short vertical rise to the flue before the pipe turned to run out level and sideways through the wall, giving the smoke a first upward pull to catch hold of before ever it had to travel across. She cut a small preheat hole low down on the run of the pipe and shaped a crude little funnel from a scrap of bright tin so that she could hold a burning twist of paper to it and warm the whole length of the cold flue through before she ever lit so much as a chip in the box below, priming the dead pipe into life the way a man primes a dry pump with a first poured cup of water. Then she touched a flame to a twisted paper at the mouth of the firebox and watched, holding her breath. And this time the draft took hold at once and pulled the little flame sideways and up and away, clean and eager and strong, hauling the whole air of the room behind it in a long, steady breath. The second fire burned clear from its very first curl of smoke. It went precisely where she had built it to go out and away into the leeward cold, and it left the air of the chamber entirely untouched. Only then, and not one moment before, did she call the children back down the ladder, and she watched that flue like a hunting hawk the whole while they sat near it, because a lesson bought at so dear a price was not one she had any intention of ever unlearning. The things she had built, she understood at last. Sitting in the newly clean and quiet warmth of it was never meant to beat the winter in a fair and open fight. It was meant to refuse the fight altogether. The earth wrapped all around the chamber held a far steadier temper than any air ever could above it. 7 feet down into the ground, the clay gave up its stored summer warmth only with an enormous slow reluctance, and it took on new winter cold just as slowly and grudgingly in return. The stacked stone and the packed clay of her walls did the very same thing. They were not heaters, any of them. They were a bank, a great cold vault, and heat was the coin she meant to deposit into them of an evening and draw back out of them all through the long night. Above the ceiling, the horses and the mule breathed their slow, patient warmth up into the deep, dry oat straw, through every black hour without fail, and the straw held that warmth trapped against the underside of the roof, and a little of it filtered down through the crossed timbers to meet and mingle with the heat rising off the bank stone below. Her small firebox had only one modest task in all of this grand arrangement. Each evening she would burn it for perhaps 2 hours, no more than that, warming the stone and the clay and the deep earth wrapped around them, charging the great cold bank with heat. And after that, the room would carry the whole of the night entirely by itself on the warmth it had stored and refused to let go. She built a sleeping platform of cedar planks 16 inches up off the floor, because the coldest air in any room always sank and pooled low along the ground, and she meant her children to sleep up above that cold pool and not down in it. Then she began night upon night to keep a careful ledger of the things she had wrought, and the climbing figures in that book were the only applause she would ever receive for the whole of it. Outside 14 degrees, the barn above 31, the chamber before the evening fire 46. 2 hours after the fire had died away to gray coals 53. The numbers were not grand, and she knew it. A fine parlor in a townhouse back east would have laughed aloud at 53 degrees and called for more coal. But she was not building a parlor for people with coal to spare. She was building the one single place in all of Dunmore Coulee where a 7-year-old girl's fingers would stay pink and warm and alive straight through a January night. And the modest climbing figures in her ledger proved past any further argument. The one hard thing she had staked her children's lives upon, that heat kept and hoarded, was worth more in the end than heat made and lost. The valley's warnings did not soften as her walls rose whatever she might have hoped. If anything, the Coulee grew only surer of her folly the nearer she came to finishing the thing, because a work half built could still be quietly abandoned with some scrap of dignity left intact. But a work finished and moved into was a woman's flat public declaration that she had meant every strange minute of it all along. Verna Applewhite took to watching the two Carrow children at their school lessons with a soft pity that was a great deal worse to bear than any switch marking aloud the faint smell of the barn on their clothes. To the older girls, noting how tired little Etta looked of a morning, how very quiet Silas had lately grown. She did it, Elspeth had not the smallest doubt, out of a real and aching and wholly genuine kindness. That was the whole trouble with the Valley's mercy start to finish. It was sincere, and it was wrong. And there is no fighting a sincere and general wrongness with anything at all in this world except the slow passage of time and the plain proof of events. It was the schoolyard, though, that carried the sharpest edge, as the schoolyard always will. The big red-faced boy had discovered that his insult drew a laugh from the other children, and a laugh is meat and drink to a cruel child, so he pressed it day after day, until one gray afternoon Silas came home with a split and bleeding lip knuckles scraped raw down to the meat, and a silence in him deeper and colder than any he had worn yet. Elspeth cleaned the cut without a single word of reproach, dabbing the blood gently away, while the boy stared fixed at the middle distance and gave her nothing. Only when she had finished and was wringing out the cloth did he finally speak low, more to the wall than to her. "He said you'd gone out of your mind. He said everybody in the whole valley knows it for a fact now. He said his pa says the Reverend's going to have us taken clean away from you before the snow's deep." His voice cracked clean across the last of it, not from the pain of the lip, but from the far worse thing underneath. "Is he, Mama? Is the Reverend going to take us?" She set down the bloodied cloth and took her son's bruised face in both her hands and turned it gently up to hers, and she did not lie to him, because he was 10 years old and more than old enough to know a lie when it was told to him, and because she had never once in his whole life given him a single one. "No man on this earth is taking you anywhere, Silas Carrow," she told him, and there was cold iron laid all through it. "Not the Reverend, not his whole church council, not the entire valley walking up my road together, shoulder to shoulder. I buried your father in that ground out there with my own 2 hands, and I will not hand his living children over to strangers because our good neighbors have got themselves frightened of a warm room. Do you hear me? You belong to this family, to me and to your sister and to the memory of him. The winter cannot change that, and neither can any preacher living." The boy looked at her a long, long moment, weighing her words the careful, slow way he weighed everything now so much older than his years. And then at last he nodded once, and something bound tight in the set of his thin shoulders eased and let go. But she saw too in his eyes the shadow the Reverend's word had already cast over her son, the fear that had lived in him for days, and she hated Amos Rourke for the casting of it more purely and completely than she had hated anything at all in this world since the night the pneumonia took Tobias out of it. Etta carried her share of the same fear differently in the smaller and stranger ways of a very young child. She had made a kind of uneasy peace with being a fox, more or less, but she woke sometimes in the dead of the night gripped by a certainty that the barn cats were watching her from the black corners of the chamber with their green lamp eyes, and she would not settle back to sleep unless the lamp was left burning low, which cost precious oil that Elspeth could ill spare across a whole winter. And the little girl had begun to ask questions that cut her mother in wholly unexpected places. "If we're foxes down here now," she said one evening, watching her mother tamp a fresh layer of ash beneath the cedar sleeping riser, "does that mean Papa can't ever find us again? He knew the cabin. He lived in the cabin. He doesn't know the hole in the ground." Elspeth's hands went still on the ash. She gathered the child in against her side and told her, in a voice she kept level only by main force, that a father who had spent the whole of his life keeping the weather off the backs of his family would know a warm, dry room for his own, the very instant he laid eyes on it, wherever in the world it happened to be, and that he would be prouder of this hole in the ground than of any fine house he ever raised standing up in the sun, because this one, and this one alone, had been built by the wife he had taught with his own patient hands, for the children he had loved past all, speaking out of nothing whatever, but what the hard world had left lying loose upon the ground. Etta considered the whole of this, with her small, solemn face, weighing it as gravely as her brother weighed anything, and decided at last that it was very probably true, and slept. The reckoning she had been bracing herself against for weeks came at last on a hard, bright, bitter afternoon in the first week of December, when the Reverend Amos Rourke rode up the freight road with 2 men of his church council, flanking him left and right, and reined in his horse at the very edge of the Carrow yard, as though he held some deed to the ground beneath its hooves. He had come, he announced from the saddle without dismounting, to see the place with his own eyes, before the deep cold came down and made a tragedy of it, so that the council might judge for itself whether Christian children were being kept in a fit and wholesome home, or whether the time had come to act. He said it all in the flat tone of a man performing a distasteful duty that a lesser man would have shirked, and the 2 councilmen who flanked him wore the plainly uneasy faces of neighbors who would far rather have been anywhere else on earth that afternoon, but who had been shamed into the riding of it by the sheer unbending certainty of the Reverend beside them. One of them she knew, a hard-working farmer named Hollis, whose own 3 children coughed their way through every February of their lives in a cabin no warmer than her own had been. Elspeth stood in the open door of her barn with the ledger still in her hand, for she had been at her figures when they rode up, and she understood at once in a single cold flash the exact shape of the trap the moment had laid for her. To refuse them to bar the way and send them off was to hand the Reverend the very proof he had come hunting for. A woman who would not show a soul her children's beds plainly had beds she was ashamed of, and the council would ride home in the dusk and confirm to the whole valley every dark thing he had ever whispered of her. But to open the hatch and let them down was to lay bare the whole of her long secret labor, every stone and seam and salvaged timber of it, to the cold judgment of men who had already made up their minds against it before ever they saw it, men who might well find in the sheer strangeness of the thing the exact excuse they had ridden all this way to find. Either road ran downhill into the dark. She had one single beat of her heart in which to choose which. She stepped back from the oat bin bent and lifted the hidden hatch and let the thin winter light fall down the ladder into the room she had made. "Come down and see it, then," she said, her voice carrying flat and clear and steady across the frozen yard. "Come down and judge it with your own eyes, since you'll none of you take a widow's word. But you will judge the thing itself, Reverend, the thing that is truly down there. You will not judge the story that this valley has spun up out of its own fear." They went down, the 3 of them, awkward and stiff on the ladder in their heavy coats, and they stood together in the low, warm chamber and looked about them with the wary, braced distaste of men who had come fully prepared to be appalled by what they found. And Elspeth stood at the foot of the ladder and watched their 3 faces war openly with what their own senses were telling them. There was no stink of the animals down here. None, only the clean, dry mineral smell of stone and clay and a little wood smoke. There was no damp anywhere. The walls stood sound and dry to the questing hand, and the floor rang firm and solid underfoot. And there was warmth, real and steady and enveloping, wrapping itself around the 3 of them, the very moment they came down out of the barn's raw, killing cold. A warmth that had them loosening their thick collars at the throat before they were even aware of their own hands doing it. Hollis, the farmer, whose own little ones coughed all winter long, crouched down without a word and laid his bare, weathered hand flat against the stone of the western wall. And Elspeth saw the confusion cross his honest face like a cloud shadow crossing a field when the stone came away warm under his palm, warmer by far than his own hearth had likely been that morning. But the Reverend had not ridden all this way to be persuaded, and a man who has staked the whole of his authority on a verdict does not surrender that verdict merely because the stones have failed to horrify him as promised. He straightened up from his stooped inspection with his jaw set hard. There was a wrongness here, he insisted, that went far past mere warmth or the presence or absence of damp. an unnaturalness in the whole notion of a woman burrowing her own babies down into the dirt like some creature of the field den, and no cleverness of stonework, however real, could ever make such a thing a fit and seemly thing before God or before the good people of this valley. He would grant that she had kept it dry for now. He would grant that the room stood warm for now on this one mild afternoon. "But the winter has not yet come, Widow Carrow," he said, and his eyes above his beard were as cold as the frozen ground she had dug her way down into. "It has not yet come. I will not settle this thing today on the strength of a single warm hour. I will come back. I will come back the moment the first hard storm has broken and spent itself over this valley, and I will see with my own eyes how your fox's den down here holds up when it truly finally matters. And if I should find these two children suffering in this pit cold or sick, or wanting the counsel will remove them from your keeping, that very same hour, and no plea of yours, and no cleverness of yours, will stay my hand." He climbed the ladder back up into the daylight without another word, and his two councilmen followed after him. Hollis, last of the three and slowest, glancing back over his shoulder just once at the warm, dry stone, with something in his face that was no longer anything at all like pity. She stood at the mouth of her chamber and watched the three of them ride back out down the freight road into the low red December sun, and she understood that she had now two separate clocks ticking against her at once in the same cold dark. There was the winter itself coming down on its own unknowable schedule, out of the north, ready and eager to test to destruction every stone and seam and joint she had labored to set. And there was the Reverend who had sworn a public oath to arrive hard upon the winter's very heels, to weigh her two children in the pitiless balance of a storm and carry them off if the scale tipped wrong. She could govern neither of them. She could not hurry the one nor slow the other. She could only be ready when they came, both of them, and readiness was the single thing in the whole affair that remained entirely within the compass of her own two hands. So she gave the last of her strength to the one thing she could still change, which was the room's own small remaining failures, the quiet, hidden weaknesses that would grow teeth and claws if the deep cold found them first, before she did. 3 trial nights in, she came down before the dawn and found tiny beads of water clinging to the underside of one cold beam near the hatch, where the warm, rising air of the room met the chill pouring down through the plank floor above and gave up its moisture in a fine, cold sweat. The lower hem of Etta's blanket she found hung too near the floor had taken on a faint dampness she could feel between her finger and thumb. She wrote nothing at all in the ledger for a long while over that discovery, only stood and looked at it. Then she answered it as she answered everything. She hung a heavy wool curtain across the foot of the ladder to serve as a baffle, so that the cold spilling down through an opened hatch would strike the wool and slide harmlessly aside, rather than falling straight and cold onto the sleeping beds below. She spread a fresh, thin layer of cool wood ash beneath the whole of the cedar riser to draw the last of the dampness downward and away before ever it could reach the bedding. And on the leeward wall she cut a narrow second cross vent slit and fitted it over with a close sliding cover of thin wood, so that the room might take a small measured breath of clean fresh air of a night, without giving away the whole hoard of its stored warmth in the bargain. A few mornings after that, Silas found the small prints of mice tracked in the dust around the oat bin hatch, drawn in from the cold to the very same hidden warmth that sheltered his family. And Elspeth answered that intrusion too. Wrapping the 4 legs of the feed bin in scavenged tin, the little climbers could get no purchase on, and packing every gap they might slip a body through with horsehair driven home hard into wet clay. None of it was the sort of work a man ever boasted of afterward at the store. Not one of the small fixes would have drawn a second glance from a rider passing on the road, or filled so much as a single sentence in the telling. But survival in that hard country had never once turned upon the grand and the impressive. It turned always and only upon small weaknesses answered before they could grow into large ones, upon the beam wiped dry, and the ash spread fresh, and the mouse gap plugged tight, upon 100 quiet, unremarkable corrections that no living soul but the ledger would ever know she had made. For a full week she went down and checked the room in the last dark before the animals stirred, and she wrote in the book what she found. Bedding dry, drafts steady and clean. The morning temperature taken with no fire at all, burning through the whole of the night, holding between 47 and 49 degrees. She did not once let herself take open pride in the figures, because pride was a thing. The winter had a long, patient way of collecting the dead on. She only drew one firm straight line beneath the last of the numbers, and underneath that line she wrote two plain words in the plain hand of a woman who had built her whole answer and could do nothing further to it holds better. The room was finished. She stood in it alone on a bitter evening in the middle of December, with the fire burned down to its warm banked coals, and the two children already asleep on their pallets up above the pooled cold of the floor. Etta's small breath coming slow and even and easy, without a single catch or whistle in it. Silas's split lip nearly healed to a thin pink line, the wool curtains stirring faintly at the foot of the ladder in the room's own slow secret circulation of air. Every stone was set. Every seam was answered. Every weakness she had been able to find had been hunted down and closed, and there was nothing whatever left in the whole design for her two hands to improve. She had built the thing Tobias would have understood without needing a word of explanation out of his silent teaching, and her own stubborn refusal to lay another child in the cold ground. And it held. It held better than the cabin ever had. It held better, she was quietly certain, than any house standing in the whole coulee. It held better than she had let herself so much as hope on the raw, bleeding November mornings when her palms had cracked open into the rawhide of the mattock. But holding through a mild trial night, she knew even as she stood there in the warm dark and let herself feel the small, dangerous glow of it, was not the same thing at all as holding through the storm itself. And she was too honest a woman to pretend otherwise, even to herself, even for one night. She had built her answer as carefully and as well as any woman ever built anything with her own two hands. And now two judges were riding down toward her out of the north the storm, and the man who had sworn to arrive upon its heels, and neither one of them cared in the very least how carefully she had built. They cared only whether it held when everything was on the line, and there was nothing further left in the world for her to do about any of it, but wait with everything she loved in this life, sleeping in the one room that would have to be the whole of her reply. She climbed the ladder up into the barn to fork the animals their evening ration of hay, and the wind was already rising in the coulee as she worked a thin, high keening note threading through the boards that she had learned across 2 hard winters alone, to read the way an old sailor reads a change in the color of the sea. It was not the storm. Not yet, not tonight. But it was the country itself clearing its throat, and she stood there among the dark shapes of the horses in the last failing light, with the hay in her arms, and listened to it come, and she found to her own quiet wonder that she was not afraid. For the first time in 2 long years, she had built a thing the wind could not simply walk straight through as if it were not there at all. Let it come, she thought, settling the last forkful into the rack and turning back toward the ladder and her sleeping children and her finished room below. Let it come and let it ask its question. She had spent the whole of one cold autumn on her knees in the clay preparing her reply. The morning of the 7th of January in the year 1887, the change came without any sound at all, and Elspeth felt it in her body before her mind had caught up enough to name it. The horses stood wrong in their stalls, unnaturally still, their great heads hanging low and their ears turned back flat, as though they were listening hard to something moving deep underneath the ground. The old mule had swung its whole hindquarters square round to face the north wall, and stood planted there, refusing to face the doors, bracing itself against a threat it could plainly smell on the air, but that she could not yet see with her eyes. The very air lay heavy and thick over the whole coulee, waiting as though the entire valley had drawn one enormous breath in the night, and then simply forgotten or feared to let it back out. She carried her thermometer and her notebook out into the yard through that terrible listening stillness, and read the glass by the flat gray light of the dawn. 9 degrees above zero, the north wind steady but not yet cruel, and the whole sky from the eastern ridge clear across to the western one, gone a hard, flat, dead white, the exact bloodless color of an old bone, left too long out in the sun. By midday, the mercury had slid down below zero and kept right on falling, and the snow no longer drifted gently down out of the sky the way honest snow does. It came sideways. The wind took the whole coulee in its fist and drove the white before it in a solid, hissing, blinding wall hour upon hour, without any pause until the ground and the air and the far ridge and the near fence all melted together into one single blind, roaring color, with no seam anywhere in it that a living eye could find to hold to. Elspeth carried the animals their water and broke the thick ice on the trough with hands already gone half numb, and came back to the barn with her face stinging raw and her eyelashes crusting white and heavy. She had seen storms in this country before. She had buried a husband through one and very nearly a daughter through another. But she had never in her life felt a sky arrive with this weight in it, this deliberateness, this awful, settled patience, as though the winter had at long last condescended to answer the very question she had been building toward all the long autumn and had decided, having condescended at all, to answer it with the whole of everything it had. By the second night, the drifts had climbed clear to the top rails of the fences and kept on climbing, swallowing the wire, then the posts, then the whole line, smoothing the broken country over into one soft, smooth, unbroken, killing white. And out beyond the fences on the open range, where no barn or bank or shelter of any kind stood between them and the wind, the cattle began to die. They drifted before the storm, the way cattle always will, turning their tails to the wind and walking blind before it mile upon mile, until at last a fence line or a coulee wall stopped their drifting, and there they bunched and stood and could go no further, and there the cold took them where they stood. It took them in the hundreds across the territory that week, and in their thousands, before the whole long horror of it was through whole herds, frozen upright and solid in the drifts, with the rimes standing thick as winter fur along their backs, and their eyes gone to ice. Gideon Ashford would lose the better part of his own small herd in those days, good stock he had built up over 10 hard years, and Ezra Coleman more than half of his, and men who had counted themselves prosperous in the fall would count themselves ruined by the spring. The storm asked no man's leave and struck no bargain with anyone. It measured every wall that leaked its air, every roof that surrendered up its heat, every chimney that had lost its draft under the packing snow, every woodpile that a family had cut too short and too green in the easy golden days of autumn. It measured the lungs of the very old and the very young. And beneath all of that, though not one of them would ever have named it so out loud, it measured every man's private pride in the shelter he had trusted his family's lives to, and it found a very great deal of that trusted shelter wanting. Gideon Ashford fed his stove from before the dawn until long past full dark, splitting and feeding, watching the thermometer nailed beside his window, refused to climb past 34 degrees, no matter how much of his dwindling wood he crammed into the firebox. His wife heated smooth river stones on the stovetop and wrapped them in scraps of wool and tucked them down beneath the blankets against their shivering children's feet. But the stones gave up their borrowed heat within the hour and went cold and dead again in the dark and had to be carried back and heated once more, and again all through the endless black night. When Gideon at last went out and counted what remained of his woodpile against the fury still howling down out of the north, the plain arithmetic of it frightened him worse than the cold had. He had cut what any sensible, careful man in that country cut for a hard winter. He had not cut, could not have dreamed of cutting for this. If the storm held on another whole week, February would find him with the wood already gone, and his family still to keep alive somehow through the worst 2 months yet to come. Farther up the coulee, the storm found old Ezra Coleman out in a different weakness entirely. His cabin was the largest and finest for miles, a standing point of quiet pride, to an old man who had raised every log of it with his own hands in his prime, but its broad, shallow fireplace ate wood very nearly as fast as it could make heat, and it threw the greater part of what heat it made straight up the wide black throat of the chimney and out into the storm. His aged father sat wrapped in every quilt in the house, with his chair drawn as close to the flames as a body could stand, and still the cough went down deeper into the old man's chest with each passing day, that wet, rattling, tearing cough that Ezra had heard too many times across too many long winters, in too many failing neighbors, the exact sound of a Montana winter beginning at last to win. The very man who had ridden all the way out to Elspeth's woodpile to warn her gravely and truly that damp ground ruined the lungs, now sat helpless beside his own great, roaring, honest, insatiable fire, and watched the dry, killing cold take his own father from him anyway, one shallow, rattling breath at a time, and there was not one thing in the world his fine, large cabin could do to stop it. At the little schoolhouse cabin where she boarded through the term Verna Applewhite, woke on the second night of it to the smell of smoke that had no business being in the room with her. The snow had packed itself hard around the chimney cap outside until the draft all but died in the flue, and the fire, choking for want of air, had begun to push its own smoke back down the chimney to gather and thicken in a low, bitter cloud along the ceiling of the single room where she lay. She threw open the front door to clear the deadly air, and the storm answered her the very instant she did it, blasting a solid wall of driven snow clear across the floor and dropping what little warmth the room had held in one long, freezing breath, so that she stood there in the doorway, coughing and shaking, forced to choose between the smoke that would smother her slow in her sleep and the open cold that would kill her fast, with no third door anywhere to take. All across Dunmore Coulee, that same brutal choice was being made that week in 100 small and desperate ways. Rocking chairs went into fireboxes, and then the shelves off the walls, and then the very doors off the inner rooms. Families abandoned every room in their houses but one and crowded together into it, all of them, because heating a whole house had passed clean beyond the reach of any woodpile left standing in the valley. And no one in those days spared a single breath to speak of the barn-buried woman. Not because the valley had changed its mind about her or come around to her way of thinking. Because the cold had stolen from every one of them the time and the strength a person needs to hold an opinion at all. Down below the barn, in the one room in all the valley built against exactly this, Elspeth kept her small, disciplined evening fire of 2 hours and let the banked stone carry the rest. And for 2 full days and nights, the chamber held just as she had sworn to Silas that it would steady and dry and warm, while the whole world above it died by slow inches. Silas kept the ledger faithfully current in his careful hand, reading the thermometer aloud to her by the steady lamplight, taking a plain, hard pride now in the numbers he set down. Etta, the child who had once feared the dark beneath things worse than anything in the world, slept now in the very deepest heart of that dark without so much as a lamp left burning, because the warmth of the room had done what no reassurance from her mother's lips ever could, and had made the underground a safe and settled place at last, in the small girl's own sleeping body and memory. Elspeth watched her daughter's untroubled, sleeping face in the low light, and thought that if the whole valley had been right about her all along, and she truly had gone clean out of her mind, then her madness had at the very least kept her 2 children breathing easy and warm, while all the sane and pitying households in the coulee burned their own furniture in the dark to stay alive one more night. Then on the 3rd night, the storm found the one single weakness she had not been able to answer beforehand, for the plain reason that it was a weakness only the storm itself in its full fury could ever make. She woke in the black chamber sometime in the deep of that 3rd night to a wrongness in the very air of the room, a thickness, a closeness that had not been there at all when she lay down. The lamp which she had left burning very low against Etta's old fear was guttering low and small and yellow, and starved, its little flame shrunk down and leaning to one side, as though it too were struggling for breath in the room. Etta stirred on her pallet and put a small hand up to her head and said in a thin voice, thick and slurred with a great deal more than mere sleep, "Mama, my head hurts. It hurts, and the room feels small, and I can't get a big enough breath." Elspeth was up off the bed and moving before the child had even finished the words, and she knew the whole shape of it, at once knew it in her own dull aching skull and the sluggish thick crawl of her own thoughts, even as she fought them clear. The air was going bad. The room had ceased somehow to breathe. And a room that ceased to breathe would smother the 3 of them where they slept as gently and as surely as it ever smothered a drifting sailor, becalmed at sea without pain, without struggle, without any of them ever once waking to know it, the exact quiet death she had built the whole of the venting to hold forever at bay. She snatched the sliding cover off the cross vent she had cut in the leeward wall, and no clean air at all came through the slit. She pressed her whole face flat against the cold opening and felt nothing. No draft, no breath, no faintest thread of cold air moving from the world outside, only the same thick dying stillness that had already filled the room to its brim. The vent was blocked, stopped up solid. The tile pipe that carried the chamber's foul-used air out and away to the leeward side of the barn had packed itself full of hard-driven snow and then frozen over with the ice that the room's own warm, rising breath had made and left at the cold outer mouth of it. And the storm had done in one single night the one thing that no autumn precaution of hers could ever have prevented. The room could no longer exhale. And when she scrambled up the ladder and set her shoulder hard against the hatch above it, gave only a bare fraction of an inch and then held fast, weighted down and sealed shut by a great drift that had built up across the whole barn floor in the night and frozen solid into the very seam of it, sealing her family alive inside the one shelter she had made with her own hands to keep them living. For one single white instant, the whole of it came at her at once all together. the two children going drowsy and slack in the fouling air below her, the frozen drift locking the only hatch above her, the 30 below killing cold, waiting patient on the far side of the one door that would open, and beneath all of it, the plain and pitiless arithmetic that said if she did nothing at all, if she froze here on the ladder in her terror, even a few minutes more, all three of them would simply lie back down and sleep and never once wake. She could have broken there. Another woman might have. Instead, something deep and old in her went suddenly very cold and very clear and very still. The same iron steadiness that had once counted a dying child's breaths through a whole February in the dark. And she did the one thing, the only thing that the arithmetic left her room to do. She braced her legs against the rungs of the ladder and put her whole back and body into the hatch and heaved once and again, and on the third furious heave, the frozen seam cracked apart with a sound like a gunshot, and the drift above it shifted and gave, and the hatch came up and over, spilling a whole slide of loose snow down into the chamber, and a great blast of the killing outer cold in behind it. And the cold, for the first and only time in the whole of her life, was the thing on this earth she was most grateful to feel against her face. Because cold air was moving. Air, and moving air was air, and air was the one thing the room had run entirely out of. Silas. She pitched her voice down the ladder hard and flat and low, the voice that did not admit of any argument. Up now, your sister, onto my pallet there, up close under the open hatch. Keep her head high and keep her talking back to you, and do not, whatever comes, let her go quiet on you. The boy came awake up into the fear the way children raised in hard winters learn young to do without any panic in him, moving his hands before his mind had even caught up to why, dragging his drowsy, stumbling sister across to the high pallet beneath the fresh cold pour of the opened hatch, while up above him, his mother was already climbing out into the barn's black, roaring dark to save all three of their lives with nothing in the world but her own two bare hands. The barn above was a howling maelstrom of dark and driven snow. The wind had found some gap high in the great south doors and driven the white clear across the whole floor in long, hard ridges. And the animals stood locked and frantic in their stalls, with the frost standing thick in their coats, the horses stamping and blowing and rolling their eyes, the old mule screaming out once high and awful into the dark. Elspeth caught up the iron poker from beside the buried firebox below, and a burning twist of lamp wick guttering in a tin cup shielding the small flame with her cupped hand, and she went along the north wall of the barn toward the leeward side, where the vent pipe came out through the boards, wading through the drifts to her knees, feeling her way blind along the wall with her free hand, because no lantern on earth would have stayed lit in that wind. She found the mouth of the vent by memory alone, a low dark shape she knew the place of in her sleep, and it was choked white and solid, packed to the throat with driven snow, and stopped hard at its cold heart with a plug of ice. And here at the very hinge of all their lives, the small tin funnel and the fussy trick of the preheat hole, the fiddling little improvisation that had felt like nothing much at all when she made it back in the mild autumn, became the whole difference between a family that woke in the morning and a family that did not. She could not simply claw the snow away. The ice at the pipe's cold core would only freeze it shut again the very instant she turned her back. She warmed the iron head of the poker in the small guttering flame of the wick, thrust it hissing into the choked throat of the pipe, and worked it against the plug of ice, drawing it out to reheat and driving it back in again, over and over and over her face, inches from the frozen mouth, and the wind clawing endlessly at the little flame in her cupped and freezing hand, until at long last, she felt the ice plug give way all at once, and heard faint and thin and perfect beneath the great roar of the storm, the one small, clean sound she had been praying for on her knees in the snow. The pipe pulled a breath. The blockage broke, the throat cleared clean, and far below her the room began for the first time in an hour to draw its foul-held breath up and out and away into the night. She was not finished yet. She fought her way back along the wall to the hatch and dropped down the ladder into the chamber where Etta lay pale on the high pallet, with Silas gripping both her small hands hard in his and talking to her. Talking and talking. A low, frightened, unbroken stream of it, telling her about the fox and the wind and the warm, safe den, The wind could never find keeping her tethered to the waking world by the one thin thread of his own steady voice. Elspeth propped the hatch a careful hand's width open on a length of stove wood, so that a thin, clean, cold draft would fall down through it and marry the freshly cleared vent below, and together pull the whole air of the room sweet and living again. And then she knelt down on the packed clay floor and gathered both of her children hard in against her at once, and she felt with a flood of relief that buckled her at the knees. The air of the room turned crisp and sharp and cold and alive all around the three of them. Etta's color came back to her by slow degrees, the gray leaving her small face. The child's aching head began to clear, and the lamp, when Elspeth reached over and turned it back up, burned tall and yellow-white and straight and steady, no longer starved, no longer leaning, and its plain, strong steadiness told her more surely than any thermometer ever could have that the room was breathing again and that they would all three see the morning. Silas looked at his mother across the body of his half-sleeping sister in the strengthening lamplight, this boy who had come home not a month before with a split lip and a broken faith in her. And there was something wholly new in his young face now, something that had not been there when the valley's cruelty was still the very worst thing he knew of the world. "You always told me," he said, his voice unsteady, but climbing up towards something very like awe. "You always said the wind can't ever take what it can't reach and touch. But it almost did tonight, Mama. It almost got all the way in." She held his gaze steady and gave him the whole truth of it, because he had earned the whole truth by holding his sister to the waking light with his own voice, while his mother fought the storm above. "It found the one door I left it open," she said. "The one I didn't know I'd left. And so I climbed up and I shut that door too. That is the whole of it, my son. That is all it ever is in the end. You find the way the winter got in, and you close it, and then you keep on closing them one after another for as long as it takes until there are no more doors left anywhere for it to find." The boy nodded slowly, taking it deep into himself, and she watched the very last of the Reverend's long shadow. The buried fear that his whole family might, after all, be a family built on his mother's madness, go finally and completely out of her son's eyes. And in its place came the plain, hard-settled confidence of a child who has helped his mother hold a door shut against death itself in the black heart of the worst night of his life, and found that the door and the mother held. They did not sleep again that night, the three of them. They sat together in the breathing dark, with the small fire built back up warm and steady, and the fresh, thin, cold thread falling clean through the propped hatch overhead, and Elspeth kept her hand on the pulse of the room. The whole while the way she had once kept her hand flat on a fevered chest, feeling for its breath, and the room did not fail her again. By the gray light of the fourth morning, the wind had at last begun to ease, not into calm but into simple exhaustion, dropping down from its full killing scream to a long, low, ragged moan across the drifted and buried country, and the thermometer she carried up into the barn to read stood at 25 degrees below zero and no longer falling. The storm was not finished with the valley, but it had spent the worst of its fury, and the room she had built tested at the very last by the one weakness the winter itself had made, and she could not have foreseen had held, because she had climbed up out of it into the heart of the storm and made it hold with her own two hands. It was in that first gray lull, with the snow no longer flying sideways in a blinding wall, that Gideon Ashford stepped out onto his own porch to look down the whole white length of the ruined valley, and to read in the smoke of his neighbor's chimneys the grim register of who had lived through the night and who had not. One cabin after another still carried its thin, brave ribbon of gray wood smoke up into the flat white sky, and each faint thread was a family still alive at its fire, and he counted them off one by one with something like prayer. Then his eye moved on down the coulee to the Carrow homestead at the ragged eastern edge, and what he saw there, or rather what he did not see, stopped the breath cold in his chest. The cabin stood dark, its chimney stone cold and smokeless. The horse barn hunched half-buried under a great drift that had climbed its whole north wall clear to the eaves. There was no smoke above any of it. There was no track, no movement, no sign at all of any living thing having crossed that yard in days. And on the Montana frontier in the fourth morning of a killing storm, a homestead standing with no smoke and no track meant one thing, and one thing only, the single terrible thing every man in that country had learned young to read and to dread. It meant the cold had gotten in. Gideon stood a long while on his porch with the guilt rising slow and cold in him like floodwater climbing a wall. He had seen her carrying that bedding to the barn back in the mild autumn, and he had touched his heels to his horse and ridden on by. He had let the story grow legs at his own warm supper table. He had held his tongue and said not one word when the Reverend stood up and threatened to take her children away, had told himself over and over that it was none of his affair to meddle in. And now the smokeless barn stared back at him across the whole white ruin of the valley like a standing accusation he could not make himself look away from. That night he lay awake in his bed listening to the wind scrape and worry at the eaves and the whispers he himself had helped to carry. The barn-buried woman the poor widow lost to her grief came back to him now with an entirely different and terrible weight. They no longer sounded to him like pity. They sounded exactly like the thing a valley says of a woman just before it goes out and finds her frozen stiff and blue with her two children gathered dead in her arms. Before the light of that fourth day had fully come with the glass still standing at 25 below, but the wind fallen at last enough for a man to move on. Snowshoes, Gideon Ashford wrapped a wool scarf across his whole face until nothing showed to the cold, but his two eyes filled a flask with hot water and bound it up in an old blanket against his chest to keep the very water from freezing, and set out across the drowned and drifted country toward the Carrow place. Better than 2 miles of buried ground lay between the two homesteads, and every fence he had known his whole life had become a nameless white ridge, and more than once he lost the line of the road entirely and stood turning slow in the blind white until some half-remembered shape of the land gave it back to him. He kept on regardless. He told himself with each floundering, sinking step that someone had to go and someone had to look, that a man who had ridden past her in the golden autumn owed her at the very least the plain decency of finding her in the ruin of the winter. And as the buried barn rose slowly at last out of the blowing white ahead of him, he steeled himself for the sight he was by now wholly certain waited on the far side of that door, a cold black hidden hole in the ground, and a mother frozen over the bodies of her two children. A woman who had trusted a madwoman's notion one single winter too far. It took him the better part of 10 minutes to force the barn door open against the hard drift that had packed itself against the boards, hauling and kicking at the frozen latch until it finally gave and swung inward. He stumbled into the dim interior, braced with his whole soul for the stillness of the dead, and stopped dead himself. The air inside the barn was cold, yes, but it was not the murdering, open cold of the country he had just crossed. 3 horses lifted their long heads and turned to look at him alive, their breath pluming gray in the gloom. The old mule shifted its weight from one foot to the other and settled again. Fresh hay lay forked into the racks. The water buckets had been broken free of their ice not long before the broken plates of it still floating and knocking softly on the surface. Someone had been here. Someone had risen and done the whole morning's chores in the very teeth of a killing storm. Someone in this place was alive. Gideon stood there in the barn, with his heart hammering against the frozen flask on his chest, unable to make the living scene before his eyes agree with the smokeless dead roof he had read from his own porch across the valley, and then from somewhere directly beneath his own 2 boots, a small, clear voice came floating up through the floor. "Mama, is that Mr. Ashford up there?" He went utterly perfectly still. The voice had come up out of the ground, out of the frozen earth beneath the plank floor of a barn on the 4th day of the worst storm the Coulee had ever known. A child's voice, warm and unhurried, and entirely impossibly unafraid. A narrow panel beneath the oat bins swung suddenly upward, where he would have sworn on the book there was nothing at all but solid floor, and Elspeth Carrow climbed up out of the earth into the barn's gray light, with a lantern held in one hand, and Gideon Ashford looked at her and could not for the life of him find one word to say. Her face was tired, worn down to the bone, but it was clear and her cheeks were flushed warm and pink with heat, not blanched blue with cold. There was no frost anywhere in her hair, no white death anywhere in her fingers, no panic anywhere at all in her steady level eyes. "You had best come down out of there," she said to him, "before you stand about letting all the cold into my barn." He lowered himself down through the hidden hatch after her down the ladder into the earth, and the warmth reached up and met him before his boots ever touched the floor of the chamber. It was not the fierce, dry, desperate heat of a stove roaring itself out against a losing fight, the kind of heat he had been feeding his own family for 4 straight desperate days and nights. It was something quieter and deeper and older than that, a warmth that seemed to come at him from every direction at once, out of the very stone and the clay and the walls themselves, so that his hunched shoulders came down from around his ears without his ever telling them to, and the breath he drew no longer cut him going in. In the corner of the room, the small firebox sat dark and silent, with nothing in it but cool gray ash cold since the evening before. And still the room was warm. Silas sat against the wall, keeping quiet watch over his sister, and Etta slept peaceful and easy beneath a single thin blanket where Gideon's own children had shivered all week under three. And there on the plank shelf beside the ledger stood a thermometer, and Gideon crossed the small warm room to read it with his own eyes, because he flatly did not believe what the warmth on his skin was telling him. 56 degrees. He had left his own hearth-scorched cabin that very morning at 34, with the fire roaring in the box. 56 degrees here with the fire stone cold and gray since the night before, while the whole valley outside the walls stood at 31 below zero. For a long while, the man said nothing at all. He unwound the frozen scarf from his face with hands that shook, and it was no longer the cold that shook them, but something a good deal closer to shame. And he looked slowly around the impossible warm room at the peaceful sleeping child and the cold gray ashes, and the woman his whole valley had named a madwoman. In the silence he kept carried more true repentance in it than any spoken apology he could ever have found the words for. When at last he did find a word, it was the only word that mattered, the one word every doubting soul in the whole coulee would have asked standing in his place. How? Elspeth did not answer him with a speech. She had never in the whole of her life had much use for speeches. She pointed first to the stone of the wall and told him quietly to lay his bare hand flat against it, and he did, and felt it giving back into his palm a steady warmth. That stone in a hole 30 below had no earthly right to hold. She showed him next the cedar platform where the two children slept, lifted clear up above the cold floor, and the sleeping girl dry as a summer afternoon beneath her single blanket, and the thin bed of ash hidden below the riser that drew the last of the damp down and away from them. She drew back the heavy wool curtain that hung across the foot of the ladder, and showed him how it turned the cold falling down through the hatch aside from the beds. And then she struck a match and lit a narrow twist of paper and held it up near the cleared mouth of the vent, and the small flame leaned over at once steady and sure and eager toward the flue, and the draft that pulled it was clean and strong and living. "The room breathes," she said simply. "It took me 3 tries and 1 very bad night to teach it how, but it breathes now." Last of all, she took the ledger down from its shelf and put it into his cold hands, and Gideon Ashford turned the worn pages by the lantern light and read the whole autumn and winter of her labor set down in her plain, cramped hand. Every single day was there. The outside temperature and the room temperature written down side by side. The hours of fire burned and the exact wood it took to burn them. The small failures found and the smaller fixes made to answer them. The west corner answered, the beam wiped the vent. Cut the mouse gap plugged 100 quiet corrections marching down the pages toward the 2 plain words she had written more often than any others. He came at last to the record of the storm's 4 days, and he stopped and he read it through twice over to be sure of it. Across the whole of that killing storm, burning her small disciplined fire of an evening, and letting the banked stone carry every night, Elspeth Carrow had spent something near 1/6 of a cord of wood. Gideon thought of his own woodpile and of what was left of it. Near 2 full cords gone into his roaring fireplace across those very same 4 days. 2 cords of good hard split wood fed to a fire that never once climbed past 34 degrees, while his children shivered under their cooling stones, and his wife heated them again and again through the black hours. 2 whole cords burned to lose the fight. 1/6 of a cord banked to win it clean. The plain arithmetic of it settled into his chest like a stone he understood he would carry there the rest of his life. Elspeth closed the ledger gently and took it back out of his hands, and she gave him the whole of her hard-won philosophy in the plainest single sentence she owned. "The room keeps what the fire gives it. That is all it is. I never once tried to outburn the winter, Gideon. I hadn't the wood for it, nor the strength. I only ever refused to let it steal back the little warmth I'd managed to make." And Gideon Ashford, sitting there in the impossible warmth, with the plain truth of it settling over him, at last understood the thing the whole valley had gotten exactly and completely backward. Every family in the coulee had tried to survive the storm by making more heat, feeding the fire harder, burning the very furniture, and every last one of them had lost ground doing it. She alone had survived by making the heat she already had refuse to leave her. When the storm at last loosed its grip on Dunmore Coulee 3 days later, and the men could move again through the drifted and broken country, Gideon Ashford told what he had seen exactly as he had found it, and he told it not as a miracle, but as a measurement, because a miracle asks only to be marveled at, while a measurement asks to be repeated. He told it at the store, and he told it at the meeting house, and he told it standing in his own yard to any man who would rein in and listen, all of it. The smokeless roof, the vanished hatch, the child's warm voice coming up out of the frozen ground, the 56 degrees against the 31 below the ledger, the sixth of a chord. And the valley which had spent the whole autumn burying her name in soft pity slowly began to dig her back up out of it. Ezra Coleman came first of all the doubters a few days after the roads had opened, and he came carrying nothing in his hands but a folding carpenter's rule. His old father had lived through the storm, barely the tearing cough finally easing as the deep cold broke, and the old man had done his own hard arithmetic across those long rattling nights beside his great insatiable fire. Ezra said very little when he arrived. He asked only to be let down the ladder, and then he measured in a long silence the thickness of the walls, the angle of the vent, the width of the hidden hatch, the height of the cedar platform up off the floor, writing each figure down into a small book in his own cramped and careful hand. The man who had told her flat at the woodpile that winter would measure her, had come at the last to measure with his own rule the one thing in the valley that the winter could not break. And there was in his silence, as he folded the rule away and turned to climb back up into the cold, a respect that no argument the two of them might ever have had could possibly have earned. At the top of the ladder, he paused and looked back down once at the warm, dry stone and gave her the nearest thing to an apology that an old frontiersman had anywhere in him. "I told you winter would measure it," he said. "And it did. You passed and the rest of us failed, and I have lived too long and buried too many to be too proud to say so out loud." The Reverend Amos Rourke came to in his turn because he had sworn a public oath that he would, riding up the freight road hard upon the heels of the storm, exactly as he had promised to weigh the Carrow children in the pitiless balance of the cold. He came braced in his soul for the tragedy that would prove him right, all along the suffering babies in the pit, that would justify the whole hard verdict he had carried through the autumn. He climbed down the ladder into the earth with his jaw already set for a rescue. And he found instead two children, rosy and rested and warm. A little girl who had once feared the dark, now sleeping soundly in the deep of it, with no lamp at all. A boy standing straight and clear-eyed and unafraid at his mother's side, in a room warmer by far than the Reverend's own study back home, all three of them breathing air cleaner and sweeter than the smoke-choked cabins his whole flock had suffered in for a solid week. Every word of the long charge he had built against her, the neglect, the madness, the danger to the innocent dissolved and ran away like frost off a warm stone in the plain. Undeniable warm fact of the thing, and the Reverend, who had ridden up with a whole sermon ready on his lips, found of a sudden that he had no text left anywhere to preach from. He climbed back up the ladder into the daylight without taking anyone's children anywhere, and what he carried up out of that room in the place of his verdict was a deep silence on the subject that would keep him quiet on the matter of the barn-buried woman for the remainder of his days. Verna Applewhite came in her own turn as well, not now with her soft killing pity, but with a notebook and a sharpened pencil, and she copied the widow's methods down line by careful line to carry back to the other struggling families of the valley. Levi Stroud, behind his counter at the Crossroads store, found himself, before the winter was even out, ordering more clay, drain tile, and fire brick, and sheet tin, and lamp wicking than he had stocked in the whole of his years in that trade, as one household after another set grimly about turning root cellars into winter rooms, digging out sheltered sleeping chambers beneath their own stables and sheds, hanging wool baffles at the feet of their ladders, spreading cool ash beneath their children's beds. No single family in the Coulee ever copied Elspeth Carrow's room exactly stone, for no two homesteads on earth are built quite the same or sit quite the same on the land. But every last one of them, in the hard, bright spring that followed that killing winter, copied her principles in the valley that had once named her in pity, slowly stopped saying the old name at all, and began instead to say, when the first cold wind came down the Coulee in the fall, that it was a good and prudent year to build the way the Carrow widow had built. The years carried the small family up and out of that terrible winter and did not sink them under again. When Silas came of age at last and raised his own homestead farther up the territory, he did not copy his mother's room stone for stone either. He built his own sleeping chamber, only half sunk down into the earth up above the worst of the damp, for he had learned the whole lesson, and not merely the shape of it. But he built it upon the entire foundation of what she had taught him, upon the raised floor, that lifted his own family clear above the pooling cold, upon the controlled, honest breath of a proper vent, upon the double hatch that let no draught fall straight down upon a sleeping bed, upon walls that were made from the first to keep heat rather than only to make it. And Etta grew up out of the frightened fox child who had feared the dark beneath things into a strong and healthy young woman, and later, teaching the letters and the sums to children in a small settlement school of her very own, she kept a fair hand-copied ledger of her mother's on the shelf beside her Bible, its pages carrying still the weather notes and the fire hours and the careful temperatures, and written more often down those pages than any other line in the whole book. The two plain, stubborn words that had carried a family living through the worst the country had holds better. Elspeth Carrow never became famous, not beyond the far reach of one Montana valley, and she never once sought to be. She had not invented the things she built, and she knew it, and she never pretended otherwise. Long before any homesteader ever turned the first spade of that hard clay people, driven to the very edge of survival in hard climates, the world over had trusted the deep, steady warmth of the earth, had dug their shelters down into it, and banked their walls against it, and let the patient ground itself keep them alive through winters that killed everything above the ground. What set her apart from all of them was never the idea at all. It was the care, the fierce, unrelenting, particular care with which she bent that old borrowed idea to the exact and narrow shape of her own need. One horse barn, one thick loft of dry oat straw, one seam of yellow clay, a short and dwindling woodpile, and two children who depended for their very lives on the rightness of every single choice she made. She had not conquered the winter through strength, for she had none to spare, and she had never once told herself that she had. She had survived it and brought her children through it by the simple and difficult act of refusing ever to argue with its rules. Wind steals only what it is left free to touch. Water must always be given its own road to run, or it will surely take yours. Smoke must always be given its honest path up and out, or it will come looking instead for your breath in the dark. And heat, precious and dearly bought, must always be given something that will hold it fast, or the fire is nothing in the end but a slow and foolish way of warming the whole indifferent sky. The winter had never once in the history of the world stopped to negotiate with anyone. It had come down the length of the coulee, that black January, and judged every single design in the whole valley without mercy and without favor. And Elspeth Carrow, alone among all of them, had knelt in the clay through a long cold autumn and prepared her answer quietly, completely, before the winter ever once thought to ask its question.